morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. The Maine State Chamber of Commerce is pleased to be bringing you this webinar today, and we are very pleased to be continuing our partnership with Science is Us. This is a partnership that we have had for a few years now at the State Chamber, and we've been very happy to be working together. This year, we have been doing this will be part 2 in a 3-part webinar series called The Economics of Climate Change. Now, some folks may remember back in January, we had our first webinar, which was a really great program. It focused on some of the heritage economic industries we have here in Maine and how they are adapting to the effects of climate change. And today we are bringing part 2 of the webinar series, which is going to be focusing on the job market and how Maine's workforce is adapting to the future. Now, before I turn it over to my good friend Rachel to kick off today's program, I do have a few housekeeping items that I just wanted to touch base on here quickly. A couple of things. This webinar will be recorded and it will be published on the Maine State Chamber of Commerce's website at some point later today, and we will share it with our membership for those folks who are not able to join us here. And then there will be time at the end of the program for questions. We will ask folks to raise their hand if they have any questions that they would like to ask at the time, or feel free to pop them into the chat if they come up as our panelists here today are going through their remarks. I also wanted to take a brief moment to thank our sponsors who were so generous with their support, and without them, programs like this would not be possible. Our presenting sponsor and our partner in this webinar series is Science is Us. And the Maine State Chamber of Commerce webinar series sponsors throughout the year are AARP, Central Maine Power, Delta Dental, First Light, Kennebec Savings Bank, and Sun Life Insurance. Thank you again to those sponsors and for their support of the Chamber throughout the entire year. Now it is my pleasure to turn it over to my good friend from Science is Us, Rachel, to start us off today and introduce our panelists. Rachel?
Thanks so much, Ben. Again, my name is Rachel Carestis. I'm the Executive Director of Science is Us. Science is Us is an initiative. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C. at AAAS. We bring together 8 scientific and engineering organizations, including AAAS, but representing everything from electrical engineering and physics to biology and social science. And we've been working, as Ben said, with the Chamber for a number of years in Maine, really getting into talking about the importance of STEM to Maine's economy. And this current series, of course, is highlighting how that economic situation is in flux because of climate change. Also the negatives, but also the positives and the opportunities that we see there. There's a really great STEM story to be told. In Maine, about 34% of Maine's workforce is actually STEM professionals. And overall, STEM contributes a lot to Maine's economy. In fact, it is a growing portion of Maine's economy. It's $29 billion in direct contributions in 2021. That's about a 26% growth, which is more than the national growth rate for the percentage of a state's economy driven by STEM. So Maine is very much a STEM state now, and it's growing in that direction, but we'd love to see that grow even further. And one of the interesting things when we talk about that 34% of Maine's workforce that are STEM professionals is that almost 57% of those folks don't have a bachelor's degree. So we've got really large STEM workforce, and we've got folks who are very much involved in STEM at all levels of education and in a wide range of careers. And so today we're going to dive in a little bit more on that workforce, and particularly how climate change is impacting both our workforce needs and our workforce opportunities. So we have 3 speakers today. I'm going to introduce each one individually, and I'm going to start with our first speaker, who is Phil Jordan. Phil is the Vice President of BW Research Partnership, and he leads the firm's Massachusetts office. His work centers on the impact of talent on economic prosperity and sustainable communities, with a special interest in serving underprivileged populations. He is a 2021-2023 non-resident senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School Ash Center for Democratic, that's Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. That's a long school title, where he focuses on the innovation economy and clean energy. He recently co-authored a book on the global solar industry and has worked in various sectors, including academia, private sector, and in government positions. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Phil Jordan.
Great, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I don't have any slides today, but I'm going to walk through some national trends and then talk specifically about the region and the state of Maine. And I'm really excited about this series and this focus. And the last point, really about how important STEM is for this transition to a decarbonized economy, and how we often think of STEM as being, solely in I guess in the public arena, we think of it as being solely focused on bachelor's degrees and master's and PhDs, but how important STEM is across all types of occupations, even those that don't require a four-year degree. So just to give you a little bit of sense about the work that we do, our firm conducts the U.S. Energy Employment Report for the Department of Energy, as well as a number of workforce needs assessments for the National Renewable Energy Lab. And we work with a number of states, including the Maine Governor's Energy Office, on more specific needs and challenges and opportunities at the state level. And so we focus quite a lot on this transition and this workforce transition related to climate change and a decarbonizing economy. I think there are a few things that are important to note from a national context, which is sort of where is everyone at on this workforce question. And what we've been seeing is that over the last number of years, we've been conducting this work for the federal government since 2015. Employers are reporting increasing difficulty finding the workers that they need, and we know that this is true across all types of sectors, right? We hear it from restaurant owners to retailers, and certainly in energy, right? We hear a lot about need for workers and a workforce shortage. We have historically low unemployment. Our labor force participation rate, which is the number of people who are actively between the ages of 18 and 64 who are actually working, is actually lower still than the pre-pandemic level. And so lots of interesting sort of workforce challenges, yet at the same time, we are rapidly expanding the installation of new energy infrastructure, whether that be, some of the proposed offshore wind projects that are being built now across the Northeast, or building decarbonization activities, swapping out heating and cooling systems, transmission upgrades. Lots of investments at the federal level, all across the U.S., going towards building out a new infrastructure. And I think what that means is, in the short run, as these things are built out, we're not seeing tremendous transition or declines in traditional fossil industries because we haven't reached that tipping point to offset anything yet. So there are certainly some declines, and we've seen historically, coal mining, et cetera, has gone down. But for the most part, what we're seeing is just rapid growth in a time where there aren't a lot of workers. So when we talk to employers about what some of the challenges are that they're facing, there are a lot of issues that they're facing, and one of them is really about the quality of the workers and their ability to do the job. And interestingly, for these types of occupations, again, looking at a national level, one of the main requirements, right, is that you have basic education in science and technology and math, right? So we're not talking, that everybody needs to know calculus, but you need to be pretty proficient in algebra in order to really have most jobs that are related to this climate transition. One of the big bottlenecks actually for passing some of the entrance exams for some of the labor unions or some of the other non-union apprenticeship programs is that ability to perform those measurements and to conduct those equations that need to be done in order to to do the job. So this is a national trend that is somewhat alarming, because there are significant climate goals across the U.S. and in the state of Maine that are going to need a workforce that at the moment, while there's lots of effort being put towards it, there is certainly a level of concern that we may not have the qualified workforce that's needed in order to address the challenges of climate change and be able to maximize the opportunities that exist for workers to get those jobs. I did want to highlight, and I know we're going to have some discussion time, so I don't want to sort of talk too much in presenter mode here, but I did want to highlight a 2022 report that was released by the Governor's Energy Office that looks at a workforce needs assessment for the state of Maine, and really, I think lays out a number of important needs and training opportunities that exist throughout the state. Just as a few highlights, I thought I would hit on. There are about 14,500 clean energy workers currently in the state of Maine. But if you look at what those roles are, right? So those would be things like, an electrician who's doing something related to clean energy, or a construction laborer doing something related to clean energy. If you look at all the people who work in all of those roles outside of clean energy, it's about almost 10 times that number, right? So there's a lot of people in the state of Maine who are going to be impacted by this transition. Many of those, their job may just change. Others, the growth is going to require, a lot more creation of new workers. The other thing that I would note is that the wages in these careers are very competitive, and so certainly when you look across the different types of occupations that exist, there's a wide range, but there's lots of opportunities for high wage jobs in this sector, and those occupations that require a proficiency in STEM pay a premium over those that don't, right? It's an important, really important career advancement and wage element. So highlighting STEM is really, I think, critical in all this. And as I think about, what does this mean for this group? I really, think it is critically important for us to ensure that we're, working with contextualized learning so that students are getting the basics that they need so that they can advance in their careers. And then while there is lots of difficulty for employers finding folks and they feel like they have a small applicant pool, the kinds of things that the companies are offering do align closely with what workers are looking for. But there's still an issue around awareness. And so this is sort of the last piece that I wanted to touch on here, which is that as we think about the pathways that have existed, the education pathways and the training pathways, we can certainly highlight, and we do in many of these reports, we highlight specific certifications that have value and skills that have value in the marketplace. But there is a disconnect in terms of, I hesitate to use the term young people, but it is generally young people who are interested in sort of searching careers and thinking about what they may want to do with themselves. There's a fairly low level of awareness about different opportunities that exist in climate-related jobs and what those jobs do. And so when we ask questions like, would you have an interest in being a construction worker? We'll get something like 6% of respondents under the age of 30 will say yes. If we say, are you interested in a career in financial services? It's even lower, it's like 5%. But if we ask them about careers that they may be interested in related to climate change, those numbers go up to 20, 30, 40, 50% of people who are interested in working in those fields. So I think that's an important takeaway from this work, which is that if the awareness is very low, it's going to be very hard to bring folks up to speed in what is necessary. So I think the last piece, and then I'm going to be true to my time here and make sure that I don't run over my time and get into other panelists' presentation. Happy to take questions again at the end. But I really did want to emphasize this this labor pool issue, which is going to require us to think about how we attract workers from populations that are not currently active in the workforce. And that means it may be people who have a disability. It may be people who are long-term unemployed. It may be people who have a criminal background. Other issues that have kept them out of the labor force in full. Those are going to be really important for us to focus our attention on. And really, to emphasize this, I think that's going to require significant, it's probably really to start, it's adult basic education in STEM, but it's going to be a really important element for making sure that we get folks off the economic sidelines and really invigorating the economy in the state of Maine. So I think my time is wrapping up here. So I think I'll sort of conclude my formal remarks and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Phil. We're going to move on to our next speaker now. That is Rachel Chapman. She is an assistant professor of sustainable agriculture at the University of Maine School of Food and Agriculture, where she leads a group of graduate students and staff scientists in the agroecology lab. She is also a fellow with the George J. Mitchell Center for Sustainable Solutions and an associate of the University of Maine Climate Change Institute. Previously, she served as a postdoctoral researcher at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Northeast Climate Hub, where her work focused on climate change and adaptation from agricultural perspectives, as well as designing curricula for adult learners. She's going to talk a little bit about how some of those national trends that Phil described break out into Maine, but specifically how that relates to the agricultural sector in the state. And so with that, I'm pleased to hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to be part of this panel today. So I was thinking about speaking to you all today about both what makes Maine a really attractive place to be, specifically thinking about agriculture and climate change, but also some of the challenges that we have ahead of us. So as many of you, I'm sure, know, the implications of climate change vary region by region. And Maine and the Northeast in general, I would say we're in a pretty positive place, although it doesn't always pan out that way. So for example, I'm thinking specifically about the amount of water that we have in the Northeast. Sometimes we have too much water. My heart and condolences go out to the folks who have experienced flooding over the past several weeks, especially those in my home state of Vermont. However, lots of other parts of the country, as we've seen this past July, climate change will mean that they are dealing with a lot more intense heat. And from a land management sector, this is associated with increasing drought as well. So we're in a pretty good spot, although we do have our challenges ahead of us. We also have a long history of working the land in the Northeast. Obviously, Maine's forestry sector is very robust, but we also have important agriculture and marine food industries. As the Northeast in general, and Maine in particular, becomes a place that more people move to because of its, relative hospitality, or we're going to be a good place to live. I think that's going to change some of the demographics of our workforce and of the industries that rely on their workforce. So it's going to look different. And I think as a state, we can do things to attract workers in an intentional way at this point in time, in particular, and over the next decade. So one of the things that I do quite a bit of work on is thinking about how the agricultural industry can adapt to changing climate conditions and also maximize the amount of work that we can do towards this shared goal of mitigation. How that translates on the ground can look a lot of different ways depending on what particular food, fibers, or fuels are being grown. But we find through some social science research on this topic that one of the big inhibitors for farmers and foresters and rangeland managers something that gets in people's way when we think about adapting to climate change and adapting to new conditions is not necessarily what we might assume. So we would assume probably that changing one's business carries with it significant financial risk, that there is regulatory things that you need to deal with, and that the labor force is a big deal. And those are all true. But also we find that it's actually significantly associated with people's confidence in their ability to try something new or run their business a little bit differently. So there are ways that we can support agriculture, forestry, fisher people to adapt to climate change. But one of the more overlooked things that I think is of great importance is bringing folks together so they can learn about what they might need to shift from one another. So the work that I do assumes that the people who are on the ground are the experts in their industry, and that supporting them with climate science and up-to-date information will give them fuel that they need to kind of move forward and make changes in their businesses. I run a program called the Climate Adaptation Fellowship, which is really designed to do this. We enroll farmers and also agricultural advisors, so people who might work for cooperative extension or the state or federal agencies, nonprofit groups, or private consultants, so that they can come together and think about the specific implications of climate change in their location and what that means for their particular business and make adjustments accordingly. And I think this is really important from a kind of community perspective. People enjoy learning from others who have more experience than they do themselves. And I think it does bear saying that this program and other programs like it that are out there really target the owners of these businesses, the people who have decision-making power. However, we also know that climate change is going to have very dramatic effects on people who are not in decision-making positions. So workers who are out in the field or working in food processing. And we need to be attentive to how a changing climate affects folks who are working outside, their safety, not only how it affects the plants and the animals that we're growing as well. I wanted to give a couple of maybe more specific examples of what some of the things that farm businesses need to consider in light of a changing climate. For those of you who aren't kind of deeply immersed in ag, sometimes I get my blinders on and I forget to break it down a little bit more clearly, but we'll try it here. So we know that there are changing rainfall patterns in the Northeast and across the world, but in the Northeast in particular. And what that means for farmers is that the number of days that they are actually able to be out in the field working are going down. Even though we're seeing an extended growing season, we're seeing, frost ending, frost coming later in the fall and thawing happening earlier in the spring. Intense rainfall and other kind of storm events and the unpredictability of the weather mean that the number of days that people can actually be out in their field are decreasing, which means that we have to get more efficient and we have to be more nimble. And this has big implications for the workforce as well. So perhaps people might have hired a smaller crew because they could extend their work over a longer period of time, but they'll have to either invest in new technology or new systems and potentially slim down their workforce to accommodate this changing environment. So that's one example. The second that I'll give you is that we might be needing to look more carefully at the types of things that we grow in the Northeast, especially different crop varieties that might be more heat tolerant. The hotter it is, the lower the pollen viability is, which means the lower the yield. There's long literature demonstrating decreased yield with increasing extreme heat. Same thing for livestock. Some animals and some breeds of animals just don't do as well in the heat. So more research and thinking about how to move well-adapted varieties and breeds into the agricultural marketplace will be important in the future. And again, as I mentioned before, just thinking really clearly about labor and how to attract a vibrant workforce into agriculture, which is no small task. we all know that farming, and I work also a little bit in forestry, jobs like logging, these are areas where, as Bill was saying, people are having a really hard time attracting a workforce. Part of that is low wages. Agricultural workers have been exempt from minimum wage laws for a long time, and there's obviously work being done in Maine to try and change that, but it's still a fact. And it's also incredibly dangerous work. So a more succinct or a more strategic way to attract agricultural workers into our state is something that I think deserves some attention. We are at the end of my time, so I am also going to pass it off and just say thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm now going to introduce our third speaker. Vaughn Woodruff is the Vice President of Workforce at Revision Energy and leads the company's efforts to develop the resilient workforce needed to build a just and equitable electric future in Northern New England. Under Vaughn's leadership, the Revision Energy Training Center expanded solar apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs in collaboration with key community partners. He was also the founder and CEO of InSource Renewables, which merged with Revision Energy in 2021. Prior to his work for the solar industry, he was involved in sustainable housing efforts for the Hopi and Northern Cheyenne nations and worked as a public school educator in Maine, Colorado, and California. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Vaughn.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks all for having me. If you haven't had the displeasure of being with me before, I'm going to start dark, but I promise I will come out with hope on the other end. I am from Central Maine after all, so we got to inject a little bit of our kind of our perspective on the world here. So number one, I want to start by recognizing what folks have mentioned already. Here in Maine, we're old. To give you a sense of how old we are, after Jared Golden was elected, I was invited to go up to a young business leaders meeting with Representative Golden. I was 45 years old at the time, right? That gives a sense of how regions of our state are kind of grappling with this and how they show up. And if you look, I mean, we're the oldest state by median age. We are also the whitest state in the country. And these two demographics have a significant bearing on where we are. I sit on the state's workforce board, and every quarter we look at the demographics here in the state of Maine. At the end of 2022, at a meeting that we had, Mark McInerney from the Bureau of Labor Statistics showed a graph of net births versus deaths, and it looks like Enron's stock. I mean, it is going down drastically. And for those of us in rural communities, you know, we constantly hear this idea of let's just shut down the borders and we'll keep Maine people. If we do that, we have communities that are dying. And you know, that how that reflects not just on workforce, but on our communities is alarming. Another thing that's happening right now as we talk about climate change is that we are largely going to depend upon folks who we have not been holding in esteem in our economy for much of their lives, which are trades workers. We right now, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act and our state and national climate goals, have the direction and the finances, right, to invest in the types of technologies that can help to address climate change. We do not have the workers to do it. And what we're doing is we're largely expecting, you know, a number of the folks that are going to be needed to do this work are folks like electricians, that from the time they've entered the schools have largely had and received a second-class education because they haven't worked for our school system. A lot of folks who work with their hands, who have that tactile intelligence. And so this creates a very challenging demographic for us. Another thing that we have, my mom was around during another huge infrastructure investment, which was the highway system. She rode her bike outside of Pittsfield on the dirt roads that were there before they were paved for the highway system. What we're embarking on with the transition to address climate is larger than that project. And that project did not require people to work on it who would need to be supervised for 4 years directly before they could work independently. And so as it relates to workforce, and as we look at professional licensing and the types of skills that are needed, our ability to respond at a timely fashion and to move quickly is going to be limited. there is such a concern about this that prior to the pandemic, and we all are quite aware, I'm sure, of the impact that the pandemic had on our workforce, Klein Tools had put out a report called Dark by 2050, which highlighted the electrician shortage and noted that we're going to have a difficult time just keeping the lights on related to this workforce gap that we have. For every new electrician that comes in and is licensed, we're largely losing 2. And that's as we're starting to see significant increases in the demand for electricity for things like beneficial electrification of electric vehicles, of heat pumps, battery storage at both the small and large scale, solar and wind production, a lot of things that have been named here, as well as the building out of the grid, which is going to require a significant number of people. So I told you I would come with some hope and switch positive. Our workforce is going to change. And we actually have 4 counties that if I were to tell you they were in the top 1%, you would think I'm crazy. Piscataquis County, Aroostook County, Franklin County, and Somerset County, which I live in Somerset County. I do a lot of work up in this region. We don't tend to think of these as the richest places in the state, let alone the country. But these counties are within the top 1% of counties that are going to show resilience related to climate due to a lot of the factors that Rachel mentioned before. These are some of the top counties that are going to be able to handle the migration that we are going to see across this country. If you see what's happening in the Southwest this summer, it's very clear that this is coming sooner rather than later. And this provides a huge opportunity for a state that largely is dealing with a demographic shift related to our workforce. And so we have a few other positive pieces that are going on with this too, leadership. So, there's been a huge investment, as Rachel had mentioned, in my work at Revision Energy. We're in the process of expanding apprenticeship. That's due in large part to the investment made here in the state of Maine into apprenticeship through the Department of Labor, the Governor's Energy Office, and our ability to be able to expedite the building of skills and the building of careers for workers in the state through apprenticeship. We're very fortunate to have a strong infrastructure in the state to help us through that. Additionally, Maine has a really strong electrical licensing infrastructure. We can get folks into residential jobs licensed within a couple of years, which puts us in a unique position in our region. So we have a lot of really good things going for us. And I would say, in parting, one of the most promising is new Mainers and new Americans who are coming to the United States as part of that migration. They're bringing with them incredible skills, folks that are engineers, doctors, have graduate degrees, undergraduate degrees that are coming here. And we largely do not, as a society, recognize their credentials in the same way that we would recognize those who are born here and got their credentials here. And we're seeing through pre-apprenticeship the opportunity to expedite their ability to apply their skill sets that they're bringing as gifts to this country to help us as a workforce here in Maine to be able to address some of these challenges. So we have a lot of investment that we can make. Our workforce is going to change dramatically to address this. And I think for businesses across the state, if we're not investing in workforce, we're going to get left behind. And so I think it's a really great opportunity amidst this challenge to position ourselves for what is to come. So thank you for the opportunity to chat.
Thank you very much, Vaughn, and thanks to all of our speakers. I'm going to invite Vaughn, Rachel, and Phil to come back on camera, and we'll take questions from the participants. Again, if you have a question, please feel free to drop it into the chat, and we'll be moderating those and asking them. But since I'm the moderator, I get to ask the first question. One thing that all 3 of you talked about with respect to building the workforce of the future necessary for climate was, one, the importance of building that STEM workforce, but all of you talked about that workforce that does not have a bachelor's degree. And as I mentioned at the start, Science is Us has been doing some research and analysis on that question for several years. And in our most recent report for Maine, 57% of the state's STEM workers don't have a bachelor's degrees. And that's where we find a lot of those folks that Vaughn was talking about, the electricians, and that Phil was talking about in terms of tradespersons, and Rachel as well in the agricultural industry. It already is a very large portion of Maine's STEM workforce. It's obviously the key, the backbone to the workforce, and will be the backbone to the climate workforce. I wonder if we could talk a little bit, and maybe we'll start with Rachel because she talked about some of the social science research around building people's confidence of trying new things. You know, one of the big things we've seen, not just in Maine, but nationwide, is trying to eliminate some of that stigma that everyone needs a bachelor's degree or a master's or a doctoral degree to be a STEM professional. And that those degrees or those career paths that don't require bachelor's degrees, that somehow they're less important or less valuable. And there's other research out there, great research from Georgetown University, that shows that those STEM jobs pay significantly higher wages and really provide for good middle class career paths for folks. So let's maybe talk about that, because that's the thing that all three of you pointed out in your different contexts is, you know, what do we need to do to begin to show folks, whether they be young people, folks who are transitioning careers, or, you know, Vaughn mentioned folks who may be immigrants or new to the state. What do we need to do to kind of break down that stigma and really begin to promote those jobs? So I'll let Rachel go first, just because she talked about some of the social science, but anyone can jump in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think there are two things from Vaughn and Phil's presentations that pop into my head. The first, Phil, you were talking about how you frame a career path as being really important for the potential person filling that career path, their level of interest, and how we talk about them and how we kind of talk about their relevance and importance is influential. And Vaughn, I've heard you speak in the past about how great it would be if we get to a point where when a kid comes home and tells their parents, I want to be an electrician, that gets celebrated and kind of highlighted as a real service to society. And you know, we have to work together to make that happen. That's cultural change, that's social change. Getting rid of stigmas it's not easy. But in terms of working directly with people who might be filling some of these critically important career paths that don't require a bachelor's degree or higher, but are still very dependent on having a STEM background and a STEM education, I think where my research has pointed towards is something called adult learning theory, which is kind of, you know, it's several decades old at this point. It's really well established, and the themes are very intuitive, which I think points to its relevance. People need to understand the value of their work. They need to be able to take what they are learning in any given training opportunity and apply it to a real world problem. And they need to understand the relevance, and they need to feel like they have some stake in the game and some decision-making power. So I think designing outreach programs and training programs that celebrate the skills that people need to make a difference in these types of jobs and in these types of careers is important. But it's a lot of messaging and us all having more conversations about how important these jobs are.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rachel. And I would add to that, I think one of the things working for us is one that you, Rachel K, hit on, which is we're not trying to create a propaganda campaign. We're trying to correct for reality, right? Which means we need to tell the stories. We need for these jobs to be visible. We need for young people to be able to see themselves in these jobs and see themselves as being successful and understand what those benefits are. Because right now what happens is largely we elevate one type of career that often pays less and puts people in a great deal of debt, and does also serve humanity at times for jobs that we see that, you know, pay well, provide financial sustenance, and just maybe the kinds of things that some folks don't like to do, but are critically important for us all as a society.
And I'll just add to that as well, that I think part of the challenge here is that, there's a perception that STEM is really hard, right? So you see it happen where, I was in a meeting in San Diego, and they had 8th graders up, and they said, they asked questions like, all the kids were standing. They said, sit down if you don't want to make a lot of money, and sit down if you want flexibility, you don't want flexibility in your job. And it was, sit down if you're not good at math. And every single girl in that class sat down, and about half the boys did, right? And everybody knows that's like the worst thing you could ever hear, right? Like, everyone can be good at math, everyone can be good at science, everybody can do engineering, right? It really is something that can happen. And that, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to, successfully complete an engineering program, right? But these are things that I think STEM is a great term for people to think about, like, oh, I associate that with a good stable career, with making money, with, having a good job. But there's also, for a lot of people, a feeling of, but that's not for me, because it hasn't really been, that 57% statistic is something that needs to be shouted from the rooftops and highlighted so that folks know that building a STEM background is really important. And these are STEM jobs. And when you look at some of the jobs that don't require a college degree, in this energy space, in the climate space, the ones that do require STEM skills pay a lot more than the ones that don't. I mean, there's a reason why the electricians make the most amount of money, and they have the hardest entrance exam, and they have the most STEM involved, right? So I think that's another way of thinking about this, sort of the stigma and the messaging is around, making sure that young people know that they can do it.
Phil, I'm going to combine a couple of questions that came into the chat that I think picks up on what we were just talking about, but that maybe pull us out to some national examples. There was a question about how do we build these training programs so that we're getting folks trained with skills that can be transferable to multiple types of industries. So there's a question specifically about wind. It was in, it was out, maybe it's back in again. So how do we train folks for these types of careers that are also more durable? And are there any examples, either nationwide or in other states, of how to build kind of that, say, electrician base that could work on a wind turbine, but then can also work in a solar industry or an EV charging station, or any of the other things that may pop up? Any thoughts you have on national or other good examples?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing that I'll just note is that policy matters a lot, and so when you look at, say, the state of New York as an example, which is very aggressively moving its climate policy forward, they're not really having these starts and stops, because they're putting massive amounts of money on top of massive federal dollars. And so, in the case of offshore wind, right, something like a moratorium in state waters that's a challenge, right? That is a policy challenge that is going to create some ups and downs. And so I just want to put that out there, that, not to get into that debate. It's not my debate to have, but something just to think about. But in terms of how do you think about sustainability? So one interesting thing is, if we think first about the trades, and, I think Vaughn's comments about the trades are spot on. Trades workers are trained to work across a number of different projects. So if you're going to work on an offshore wind project as an iron worker, right? You are not an offshore wind occupation worker, right? That's not what you do. You don't go, you get some certifications for safety and fall training and some other things you need to be working at sea, but you're being trained and certified as an iron worker, and you're going to have work doing port development. You're going to have work doing, post tension, right? You're going to have all kinds of things you're going to be able to do. Same with electricians, same with all the other construction trades. So why does this matter, and why is this important? And I want to also pick up on the new Mainer and folks coming into the labor market for the first time, is that, and the models that work are those that incorporate a pre-apprenticeship for those types of trades, or college readiness programs for other occupations that are providing those adult basic education skills that are while they're doing sort of a learn and earn opportunity, right? So they might be working part of the time in the classroom, they might be working part of the time, in the field, getting trained up in something, and they're getting paid for it, right? So that they can actually afford to do it. And then that's providing them a base. And the reason why I wanted to sort of peel this back a little bit and why I think this question is so good is that if you can get somebody 8th grade math and 10th grade English proficiency, the world is their oyster in this economy. They can pretty much do anything. And there are so many people who graduate from high school or don't graduate from high school who don't have that and don't maintain that level of proficiency a year or two out. And so providing that adult basic education combined, or, getting more kids through those proficiencies and maintaining them while providing these earn and learn opportunities are hugely important. So on the trade side, really focusing on that pre-apprenticeship work, apprenticeship readiness that does all of that. And then the adult basic education for career advancement for, adults who are either, have washed out of the workforce or those new Mainers who are coming to Maine from another country, that allows them to get, both the English proficiency as well as the technical education so that they can enter into some of the, to those 4-year programs.
Thanks, Phil. So follow-on question for Rachel based on what Phil just said, is that also feasible in the agricultural sector? So you described a number of different things happening in ag, but also the change in climate, which may move different types of crops, but also perhaps different types of technology that may come into the sector. Is what Phil's describing there, is that also feasible in ag? It's definitely feasible in the trades.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of those institutions already set up their agricultural programs at, I'm thinking like Vermont Technical College has a great program, and there are comparable ones I know at community colleges. I'm sorry about my dog, in Maine. There's also organizations like MAFCA and other comparable ones around the country lead journey person programs, which are assisted on-farm training programs. And then I ran my own farm for 10 years and I learned from working on other farms. So I think that's where a lot of the training happens is on the farm. However, because farms, I think, face an additional level of risk because of climate change, and because labor is such an important issue, it might be worth thinking about how the state or the federal government can support farms to increase their training in the workplace by decreasing some of the risks that they face in other ways.
Great, thank you. Well, so that brings us to the end of our Q&A section. I'm going to pick up on one last comment that was in the chat and use that as our transition on our way to wrap things up. There was a comment here that sort of talks about the narrative about blue collar jobs and beginning to switch how we use language to describe some of these things, even using words like the trades, for example. One of the things we've done at Science is Us is actually a fair amount of research, communications research around this terminology, and we just use the term STEM professional. So whether you are an electrician who is a union trained electrician, or you are a PhD rocket scientist, as far as we're concerned, you're a STEM professional. And treating all of those folks in that continuum as the same, using the same language to describe them all, has been something that we found to be an equalizer. So instead of otherizing any of those groups, talking about everybody comprehensively, we actually did a program in Florida around the space industry and made the point that without the electricians and the welders and the IT professionals to build the rocket, it never is going to get off the ground, no matter how many PhD rocket scientists you have in the room. You need everybody in that continuum to make the thing fly. And so they're all equally important. You take anybody out and the thing doesn't get off of the ground. And I think we found a lot of success in that more holistic language and inclusive language. And we would encourage others to do the same thing. Stop segmenting the workforce. and talking about STEM professionals all together. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today and for this great conversation. This will be recorded and is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Maine State Chamber's website as well as on the Science Is Us website. And we are planning for our third webinar in this series, which is going to talk a little bit more about the future, not necessarily the specific impacts of climate, but how we can innovate and how we can build the sort of economy and environment in Maine that will attract new research and development, new entrepreneurship, new innovation, and new technologies, things that we will need jobs for, we'll need workers to do that we don't even know about yet. And that I think will be very exciting. So again, we want to thank our speakers, our partners in the Maine Chamber of Commerce, and thank all of you for participating today. And we'll hopefully see you on the next webinar. So thank you.